So at the core of this project is this piece right here. It's a radiator out of I think, spray pump that was made by the Bean Spray Company back in the 1920s or 30s. And so it's just a radiator, right? Like water goes in one port, it flows through this, thin metal. It's sort of thin copper that's been made into a honeycomb configuration, and then it exits through, the exit port, and it's just a way of exchanging heat for the motor. Um, and so, it's 100-year-old, maybe crappy radiator by sort of modern standards, but it caught my eye originally because, it's sort of got a beauty about it because the honeycomb here is all made of copper, and then the radiator itself is all made out of brass. And, there's signs everywhere that it's like kind of a handmade piece, right? Being made in the 20s or 30s. And so when I found this thing, sort of on a late night eBay scrolling session, it was in pretty bad shape. It was pretty, corroded and dirty, and didn't look like all that much. But immediately, it struck me because, as is evident, it looks like honeycomb. It looks like a bee's nest or something, simply because, all of these individual cells are really, certainly the same shape and even the same sort of proportions as you would expect an actual honeycomb. And the fact that the thing itself is also a hexagon really sort of sends that message home. And so when I initially saw it, what I thought, even before I bought it, is that it'd be really fun to turn it into like a sculptural piece where the focus is developing this narrative that this is like a bee's nest. This is a honeycomb, a beehive, and it's already there. It's already there, like it's already looks like honeycomb. But how can I sort of make that clear? And so the plan from the start, and as it stands currently, is to turn this thing into a lamp. And essentially it'll be hanging. I'm going to use these 3 bolts to hang it, and then put a light in this central socket. And this central socket, originally I think this is where you had your drive shaft for the engine that sat behind this, ran through this, and this was sort of how it bolted on. And so the idea is essentially to build this thing into a sculptural piece that hangs from the ceiling, looks like a beehive, and then has sort of a nice pendant light coming through. So as part of the process of making this into an eventual, sculptural piece, or just a lamp that looks like a beehive, one of the first things I thought about to make this more compelling is obviously you got the comb, but you need the bees. I wasn't exactly sure what type of bees to use. And so I scrounged around on, I don't know if it was eBay or Etsy for a long time. And what I found were these little bee pins. These are just sort of, a classic pin that you might put on like a t-shirt or whatever, in the shape of a bee. And there was sort of a balancing act of like, do you want the bee to look super cartoony and like look like a cartoon bee? Do you want it to look like a truly accurate biological bee? And this is sort of the middle ground I settled upon. In some ways, it doesn't even look that much like an actual bee, like a honeybee, but it looks enough. I don't know. There's something satisfying to me about this, that it says bee, and it's the right size, and I could get a bunch of them, and it's the right, the right level of detail to sort of comicalness that I wanted. And so, I didn't really think about it too much when I bought these, that they're just pins, so that they have, a casting that I think is probably like pewter or tin, and then they've got the little steel tack on the other side And so when I got these, I put them on there and I said, great, I really like the way that looks. It's fun, it's the right size, and I can put a bunch on here to really sell the effect. But I really didn't know how I was gonna connect these on to the copper or the radiator or the honeycomb, because they sit in there well. And I thought initially, well, maybe I'll silver solder them, and that would give a nice permanent hold. But it seemed pretty committal to solder something with, even though you can undo solder, it just is. It's a lot of work, and there's, you might damage the radiator or whatever. And so I didn't love that idea. Obviously, you could glue them. I kind of think glue is just being like a shittier solder, right? It's a permanent bond where once I place this thing down, I can't really rearrange it if I decide that looks bad. And glue is just sort of, glue is sort of always the imperfect solution. And so I don't like using glue if I can avoid it. And so really what I wanted to do was find a mechanical way to attach this pin onto this beehive. And so I was thinking, right, that this is more or less a through hole. And so there's got to be some way to essentially make it such that it can clamp onto the comb, and then I can rearrange it or move the bees around if I want to change the scene, or if something is wrong and I just want to iterate on the process. And so what I settled on was what? I figured I could find a way to, on one side, clamp onto this honeycomb by using a threaded rod and a nut, such that the nut and the threaded rod sit into the hole, and it's the right size that the sort of outer diameter of this little sexy thumb nut hits on the edge of the honeycomb or the hexagon, and it sits there. But then I needed a way to interface this threaded rod with the bee. And so what I found were these little, they're inserts for plastic, right? That you'd push these into plastic. Come on. And then you could have, it's just a threaded insert. Then you could then feed a threaded rod into plastic. But anyways, the reason these were useful for me is that, one, they interface with the threaded rod, and two, on the end of them, they have a tiny little hole, come on, that is meant to expand when you drive them into the plastic to make your threaded insert. But they're the perfect size for these bee pins. And so what you can do is there's just a physical, in the same way that a pin normally works by physically grasping onto this little nail, these threaded inserts hold on in the same way. And so that gives me a good way to interface the bee with the threaded rod. And so what you end up with is essentially something like this, where you have a bee attached to this threaded insert, which is attached onto this brass rod, which is attached onto this thumb nut. And the reason, none of this has to be brass, but I feel like, I don't know, kind of keeping with the time this thing was made and brass was big, somehow it feels right to try and make as much of this out of brass or tin or whatever as I can. And I feel like it adds a little bit to the premium effect. And so what you can do with these is more or less, the bees drop in, and then you can take the thumb nut, screw that in from the bottom, and hold the bee on to the radiator. So showing that in a slightly better way, right? On one side, you have the bee that's pinned to the radiator, the honeycomb. There's really, from afar, there's very little you can see beyond the bee. But then on the other side, you have the threaded rod, which has gone through the length of the radiator, and the thumb nut holds it in. And it's a pretty good, pretty tight fit, because this smaller diameter on these thumb nuts sits really nicely into these honeycombs, and sort of helps stabilize the threaded rod in the honeycomb, such that the nut itself really can't rattle around that much, and just a little bit of tension on that rod really holds the thing well. So in terms of the decoration, right, there's already the bees, and those are going to be on the underside of the piece, so they technically be down here where it's illuminated. But I wanted to further decorate it, and ideally with something that could sit up top, so that you had decoration both in the bottom of what you were seeing, and also sort of from the side, and preferably overhanging. And so one of the things that I think of when it comes to bees is flowers. So I thought, what's a good flower I could put up top? And I don't know. I wanted to get metal flowers because the bees are metal, the piece is metal. It's sort of all about these, I don't know, beautiful old metals in some ways. And so I thought like a metal flower, but looking at the metal flowers I could find on eBay or Etsy, they weren't that compelling, and it felt like a little bit gaudy to have the idea of all of these sort of golden flowers along the edges. And maybe it looked fine, I don't know. But what I did find during that search period were these. And these are flowers, what's Capotomante. They're these, I think, a brand or style of flower decorations that have a metal stem and then a sort of a colored porcelain flower. And I think these were sort of made in Italy historically and are still made to the current day. And a bunch of people had them for sale on eBay, and so I bought up the eBay stock of these Capotomante flowers, and I have a couple different types. There's, they're all sort of roses. I guess that one down there's supposed to be a dogwood flower, but a couple different types in a couple different colors. With the idea being that the bees will be on the underside, and then, if possible, we'll have flowers hanging close to or towards the edge of the piece, such that when you see the piece from the side or underneath, these flowers will be visible. So right now, in terms of decorations for the piece, right, we have these little bees, which are the focal point of the underside, and the flowers, these Capotomante flowers, they're going to be sitting on top and overhanging. And while these bees, I've already figured out how I'm going to hold them to the piece. The flowers are a different story, and it's not as clear to me exactly how to pin these to the top of the piece. Again, I could solder them or glue them. I don't like either of those ideas, and so I want to figure out if I can have a way of mechanically holding them to the top, similar to the bees, if I can. And these flowers, I think they're made to sort of like sit on a desk or a table, and so they sort of have a natural, plane or orientation that they can sit on. And there's little prongs and things that I can probably grab onto or force into the honeycomb. But I'm still kind of actively figuring this one out. Actually, it's a good spot right there to thread a rod through. Anyways, up to this point in this video, I've sort of been recalling the things I've already done. And now we're catching up to the point of me actively, concurrently trying to figure things out. And so where I'm currently at with the flowers is that I want to be able to, again, sort of clamp them to the honeycomb by putting essentially a bolt through the comb and somehow attaching that to the flower. And for the bees, right, sort of the second half of the bolt well, the nut, right, is a thumb nut that sits on top, and the bolt head is essentially the bee, and so it hides itself and how it's fastened. But the flower, it's a little bit, it's going to be a little bit tougher because I'm not, the flower is not the head of the bolt in the same way the bee is. And so I've thought about having like a really thin nut that sits down in these hexagons as sort of the base of, I don't know, some kind of clamping bolt or, something that holds the flower on here, and trying to essentially hide the flower, I don't know, securing hardware. But then what I thought is it's sort of like, I don't know, like a water pipe in your home where you can either try and hide it and hope that that works in a convincing manner, or you can paint it bright red and sort of celebrate, I don't know, its intrusion into the space. And so what I've decided to do for clamping the flowers is to make sort of the clamping mechanism or nut really visible. And so what I have so far are these little acorn or cap nuts that are again attached to a threaded rod, and those will sit down in the honeycomb like that. And so I don't know if it's like anatomically or biologically correct, right? It doesn't look perfect, but to me it looks a little bit like a full comb of honey. And the idea now is that you can kind of have a bee tending honey, and this, I don't know, now decorative piece also has the additional benefit of helping to secure the flowers. So where I'm at with the flowers right now is, this is going to be the underside of, well, I should say that, I'm going to try and naturally let the flower fall how it wants to, and in a way that looks good, overhanging the side of the piece. And then I'm going to use essentially kind of a bolt. Here it's sort of like a bolt with a nylon spacer, clamping this thing to the top of the piece such that it's, in a fairly secure manner. And the other side of this bolt essentially terminates in something like this, one of these little cap nuts, which will be on the underside, and it'll look, hopefully convincingly partially like a little full cell of honey. Okay, so hopefully we're getting to the part where I can kind of just stop with all the talking and get more to like actually making this thing. So where I'm currently at is the way when I made these, I don't know, bee holders, bee columns that interface with the bees, I ended up, I ended up soldering, I don't know if you can see a little bit there. Yeah, you can see a little bit of the solder. This is silver soldered with sort of like plumbing solder that's holding this brass threaded insert onto the threaded rod, just because that's the best, most permanent fixture I could get on there. And then the way the bees interface in that is that, this is one where it's just like a friction fit, and it's, fairly secure. The bee doesn't come out. It's really a good grasp on there. But if you really pull, if you really pull the bee, it will pop out. And so on these the finished ones I've made, it's glued, and I have the epoxy. I epoxy them on there, and those are sort of finishing their curing in my little toaster oven right now. But what I want to do is, in the same way that I silver soldered these threaded inserts onto this threaded rod, I want to silver solder the cap nuts onto that threaded rod that I'm using for grabbing the flowers, just because I think that's like a good, positive, secure hold. And I really don't imagine myself needing to take those threaded nuts off in the future, so I'm just going to do that now. You get a little bit of flux on the end of the rod, and then put that into the nut, and it'll sort of fill up the threads. And then I'm going to hold this into a little, I don't know, vise. Obviously this setup is a little bit jank, but you know, gets the job done. And then heat up the piece, a little torch. And then once you can see the solder start to sort of like flow out, the piece heats up, you come in with the solder. Fills in the threads. And you really don't need much. You can see just a little bit of silver sticking out on the end. I don't want to touch that. But you really just need a tiny little bit of solder to hold the thing on there, especially in this sort of low stress application. Okay, so that's the soldering of the little acorn, you know, cap nuts done. I don't know if I did like 15 or 20 of them, maybe not even that many. And yeah, you can see, you know, this is part of the reason why I didn't want to solder the rest of like the bees and things to it, is you get this discoloration from soldering, which maybe, you know, it's because I suck at it, but who knows. But anyways, you know, got to clean up the flux and the discoloration. So in addition to using these longer threaded rods that culminate in these cap nuts to hold down the flowers and to have that sort of full comb look, I wanted a way so that I could, you know, have some of these just for decorative purposes, and the rods didn't have to stick up, you know, an extra inch, or in case I wanted it to really be more covert and maybe anchor something and stay down low. I just had to get a couple different lengths of these. So instead of the 3-inch length, we got a 2-inch length now. And because the 2-inch length, when it's inserted, only sticks up just a little bit, I've got, you know, a little washer to hold that on, and then so that I can grab onto that nut with my fingers and tighten it down, I've got in these little spacer inserts. So it's more or less like a long nut that I can still turn without having to, you know, get some kind of small socket that could reach into the comb itself. So now I'm just trying to sort of mock up or test out how I want to attach all of these Capotomante flowers to the piece. And these will probably come off, you know, before the thing is done. This is more just testing out how well or how poorly my idea works. But like in this case, you can see the flower sort of naturally sits, I don't know, on this angle. And then I can kind of pinch onto it well enough with one of these little spacers, or one of these rods, one of these nylon spacers. Let's grab a little nut. It's kind of fiddly because it's so small. And maybe I'll need like a little wrench at some point to tighten these down. I don't know if they grabbed. Oh yeah, okay. But you can see, I don't know if you can see actually, this is a bad angle. So I guess now maybe you can see how this is working. The flower sort of naturally just sets on this plane, and I'm kind of taking advantage of, often many of them have little stem points that you can kind of dig into the honeycomb. Yeah, this one's got one, I think. Maybe I'm just using the leaf on this one. Oh yeah, right there. And so here, you know, I'm just taking advantage of that. And then I'm using this little spacer to, once again, kind of apply pressure onto the stem of the flower and just kind of clamp it down just a little bit. I'm not super worried that these things are really going to fall off. But, you know, this is just enough grasping strength that makes me, you know, feel a little better about it. Honestly, pretty pleased with how this thing is starting to come together. It's not up to its final stage yet, and I'm just throwing on these flowers just to sort of see how they look. and if they totally look whack. But I don't know. I think they look good, and I think the little full honeycombs underneath is kind of a fun detail, and the little compression pillars with these nylon spacers work pretty well. It's not the best hold in the world, and I'll probably add some wire in later on to sort of secure everything more permanently, but it's a good start. So really quick here, I've sort of mocked up a little scene going on, and you can see from the top it just looks like a bunch of cluttered hardware, but from the bottom you got the little bee tending to the honeycomb, and then you've got the flower overhanging. So I don't know. I think we're getting pretty close.